let's just jump right in to the presentation, and just to kind of get our bearings a little bit. We're pretty much going to be focusing on primarily 4 locations in our talk. Norcia, which is where the red dot is. We're going to focus on Subiaco, which is in this region, and Cassino, and then Rome. So we're basically staying in central Italy for our presentation today. So, pretty much all the information, for the most part, on what we have about St. Benedict and St. Scholastica comes from Pope St. Gregory the Great, who wrote about the life of Benedict and Scholastica in the 6th century. So that's pretty much the primary source of information about these 2 saints. A biography that was written about them essentially 1,500 years ago. So, what do we know about Benedict and what do we know about Scholastica? Benedict was born in the year 480 in Norcia. Scholastica was his sister. There is a tradition that Scholastica was his twin sister. Okay? So there is a tradition in the church going back, I believe, to the 9th century that she was actually his twin. So, Benedict and Scholastica came from a very privileged family in Norcia. So, especially Benedict, he had a lot of opportunities in his life. And his father eventually sent him to Rome to study humanities, to study literature. And if Benedict would have stayed the course, if he would have pursued his education, he probably would have had a very successful secular career in the world. Because from what we know about him as a monk, he was extremely influential. Probably a person filled with passion and zeal. So he could have been a very successful person in the world. He could have married and had his own family. But at so many times, when we look at the history of the church, we see these great saints. And many times, we encounter what I like to call the privileged saints, who had privileged backgrounds and who could have really been successful in the world. I think of St. Augustine, St. Francis of Assisi. But all these saints, like Benedict, they reached a crossroads in their life. Would they pour themselves into a career, a business, or would they give their all for God? Of course, we know with Benedict, with Augustine, with Francis of Assisi, they gave their all to God. One of the biggest influences in Benedict's life at the time when he was at Rome was the various Byzantine monastic communities that were flourishing in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Now, just a little history here. Rome fell in the year 476. But for the previous 100 years, it was slowly just deteriorating and collapsing. So I know, today, especially in the Catholic Church, we think of, glorious Rome. But at this time, no, Rome was in ruins. You had, they were rebuilding. You had various tribes, the Germanic tribes, probably a lot of our ancestors, coming in and out of Italy, sometimes sacking, sometimes, pillaging. So it was a little bit of instability. So the stability in Christendom, in the Holy Roman Empire, was basically in what is today Greece, Turkey, Syria, Constantinople, which today is called Istanbul. That was basically the New York City of the Roman Empire of that time. So the faith was protected, and out of the east came a lot of these monastic communities that wanted to live a very authentic Christian life. So you have St. Anthony of Egypt, who went out to the desert as a hermit. You have St. Basil, who wrote a rule for monks. And so various monastic communities were forming and flourishing in the East. Till this day, Eastern Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox Church place a strong emphasis on monasticism. And their bishops are chosen from monks to this very day. In the West, you had monks, but it was not as strictly organized per se as it happened after Benedict. So you still had monks, you had abbots, you had people living a very austere life, but it was really flourishing in the East. So Benedict was very influenced by this. Also, he was very disturbed over the lifestyles of many of the people in Rome. Many of the students, many of the people he encountered, were living very immoral lives, indulging in all the pleasures of the world. And Benedict was very much put off by this. He saw this as a danger to his own soul. He feared for his own salvation. Being in this such a worldly environment. And let's be honest, what Benedict was experiencing 1,500 years ago, many young people experience the same temptations on college campuses today in the 21st century. There's still all the temptations to lust, to binge drinking. Many college students come back and they don't believe in God anymore. So these temptations are real today, and they were real in Benedict's time. So Benedict courageously decided to abandon his education. He wanted to stop pursuing his education. And he decided also to leave his father's house. So he was going to give up everything to follow God. And now, Pope St. Gregory the Great does not get into the emotional state of Benedict or the struggles that he had in that decision, but I'm sure it was a time of trial for him because he was giving up basically his whole future in the world. And how is he going to tell his father, who probably wanted him to be educated and very successful, how is he going to reveal this to his family? We're not given the details, but it must have been a real cross for him. So, Benedict decided to leave everything and go out into the wilderness. And it reminds me of the gospel of when Christ encountered the rich young man. And the rich young man comes up to him and says, "Hey, what good deed must I do to obtain eternal life?" And Christ says, "Well, do you follow the commandments?" "Of course I follow the commandments." "Okay, great. So if you want to be perfect, sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me." Well, we know with the rich young man in the gospel, he was very sad and walked away from Christ. With Benedict, it was completely different. He relished that kind of life. So he gave away everything and left to be with God. Left everything to serve his beloved. And so where did he go? Well, he went to a deserted place outside of the town of Subiaco, which is approximately 40 miles from Rome. And he went and he lived in a cave. And while he was in his cave, he met a monk named Romanus. And Romanus lived at an abbey close by. So he befriended this young Benedict, and he helped him out when he could. And what I mean by that is they had this system. So while Benedict is in a cave, but it's very hard to get into the cave. It's very steep. So Romanus would come, he would take a rope, and he would tie some bread, he would tie some food, and he would have a little bell, and he would lower it down to Benedict. Benedict would hear the ringing bell and know that there's a meal coming. And then he would eat, and he would pull it up. Now, one story that comes down to us is that one day when Romanus was doing this, that the devil threw a rock and shattered the bell. And obviously, Gregory highlights it to show that the devil took notice of Benedict, but nonetheless, Romanus still served him. But what's interesting about that story is it seems, somewhat harmless. Okay, the bell was shattered, big deal. But you see something very interesting that always plays out in all the lives of the saints. It's, you may be in the middle of nowhere, in the wilderness, like Benedict was. Nobody really knew where it was. Family, friends, they didn't know where it was. Of course, God knew exactly where Benedict was. And one other person knew where he was. And that was the devil. Because Satan takes notice of anyone who is growing in holiness. That's what he fears the most. We look at strength in a worldly sense many times. We'll see, a big army, a powerful nation, and we'll say, ooh, wow, they're strong. Yeah, in a worldly sense, maybe they are. But in the eyes of Satan, in the eyes of the devil, his biggest threat is holiness. Why? Because holiness has the power to convert souls and to lead them to Christ. We know that's exactly what Benedict would do. So Benedict remained in the cave for 3 years. And there's this great tradition throughout Scripture I call it the tradition of the wilderness. All through the Old Testament, God calls certain people, certain figures, into the wilderness so that they can encounter him, that they can have a deep relationship with him. There's a beautiful passage from the prophet Hosea, written about 700 years before Christ, and it's God speaking about his people as his beloved bride. And he says, "Therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her." God expressed his desire to lead his people into the wilderness so they could encounter him in a profound way. We know in the Old Testament we have Moses. He goes up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Elijah does the same thing. And the reading I read at the beginning, he's in the cave where he encounters God in a still, small voice. And then, of course, in the New Testament, what do we have? We have John the Baptist. Where does he set up his ministry? On Main Street in Jerusalem? No, he's out in the wilderness. Well, how does Christ begin his ministry? After his baptism, in the wilderness. And constantly in the Gospels, Christ, it says, is going to a secluded place to pray, to speak with his Father. So Benedict enters into this great tradition that was laid down far back into the Old Testament. And I'll say this, obviously, many of us in our state in life, we can't just go out into the wilderness. We can't wander around the DuPage Forest Preserves or anything like that. We might get the police called on us. But at this parish, we have the Adoration Chapel. And what is ultimately the wilderness? It's encountering God in the silence. And so we have this gift here where you could go at any time, 24 hours a day, and encounter God in the wilderness, in the silence of that chapel. So that's why God calls people into the wilderness. So, God, of course, was watching over Benedict, and there's a beautiful story how during this 3 years, it was an Easter. It was Easter, and Benedict did not know it was Easter. Kind of lost track of time in the cave. And he was very hungry this particular day. And the story goes that a very holy priest was preparing his Easter dinner with meat and vegetables, and was getting ready to sit down to eat his dinner, when he had a vision of Christ saying, "My servant Benedict is hungry. He is starving. Go and bring him food." And so this holy priest, very obedient to God, left and walked out into the wilderness with his Easter dinner. And he's looking for Benedict. And he finally found Benedict, and he said, "Look, it's Easter. This is not a day of abstaining. This is not a day of fasting. Come, let's celebrate." So Benedict invited him up in his cave, and they had their Easter dinner together. And it said they continued long hours in holy conversation about the things of God. And I love that story because you see Benedict is turning over his life to God. And God is still not only providing him spiritual food, but he's providing the needs of his body, providing what he needs on a daily basis. Of course, he's bound to be discovered. You can't hide forever. So it's not that he was hiding from the world, but he was off there communing with God. Very soon, people are going to take notice. Well, there were some shepherds. And this is a great story. There were some shepherds in the area with their flocks, and they're looking up, on the side of the mountain, and they spot the cave. Okay, there's a lot of caves out there. Why not? All of a sudden, they see a beast walk out of the cave. Well, the beast they saw was Benedict, and he was dressed in animal skins. And he walks out of his cave. They were freaked out, to say the least. They all of a sudden see this beast, and they're like, "Oh my goodness." You could just imagine what they were doing. Probably one group of shepherds was keeping a watch on the cave, and the other group was trying to get all the sheep away from the cave, because there was this hideous beast up there. Eventually, after watching the cave for a while, they realized that it was a man. And they're like, "Oh my gosh, what is that guy doing up there? He's living in this cave." Well, after some time, they eventually made the acquaintance of Benedict. And they found out, he's this very sane and normal person, but he's also a very holy person. And they were not living necessarily the best lives. And after their acquaintance, after their encounter, after their friendship with Benedict, they converted themselves. And they began to lead a holy life. Now, after this meeting, this encounter that the shepherds had, he started to be known in the region. So more and more people are like, "Hey, there's this holy man. He's up in this cave. It's not a beast. Don't worry. He's up in this cave. Go and see him. He will change your life." So people started going out into the wilderness of Subiaco to look for Benedict. And as Pope St. Gregory the Great says, they fed him on corporal food, and he fed them on spiritual food. And I think, how true is it that holiness is a powerful force, and it cannot be confined to the wilderness. Again, in the Gospels, John the Baptist, everybody's running all over the wilderness after him. Jesus, anytime he wants to be alone in the wilderness, here comes the crowds. He gets in a boat, he goes to the other side, here comes the crowds. They go out into the wilderness. Holiness is attractive, and Benedict was genuinely holy, and the people were now coming out to him. They wanted to encounter God, and he was changing people's lives. Now, like we said, the devil took strong notice of this. And now he realized, okay, here's the deal. I have to stop him. He's converting souls to Christ now. This is a big problem. So I have to get him off this path that he's on, or he could possibly change the world if he continues on this path. So he assaulted Benedict with an extremely powerful temptation to lust. In fact, Benedict described this temptation as the most powerful temptation that I believe he experienced in his entire life. And the temptation basically was this. It was the devil projected an image of a woman who he knew a few years back, projected this woman into his mind and was inflaming him to lust. And Benedict was becoming so overcome by this that he was on the brink of changing course, literally. He said, I'm going to leave this life. I'm going to this woman. I'm going back to civilization. That's it. I don't know if I can do this anymore. But he was wrestling back and forth, trying to throw off this temptation. And what happened? Finally, in the throes of this temptation, the grace of God burst through. And Benedict saw the remedy to this temptation. Now, the remedy today we may not like, but it helped Benedict at the time. As Benedict was struggling, he saw a patch of briars and nettles. Briars are those, you have the thorns. Types of plants that have the thorns on them. The nettles, those stinking nettles, if you're ever hiking or anything, they itch and they irritate your skin. And he realized what he must do. He threw off his clothes and he threw his body into the briars and into the nettles. And he mortified his flesh. For some time, they said, he wallowed and rolled and twisted in there until the temptation had gone away. And after some time, he said the temptation to pleasure was subdued. That he conquered that fight. And after he did that, St. Francis of Assisi did the same thing. More and more people came to see him. Now, no one's suggesting, I don't think Father Gabriel's going to suggest anyone to jump in the nettles. Maybe he will, I don't know. But I think what it shows is this. Benedict loved God so much that anything that would separate him from that love, anything that he needed to do to hold on to that love, he would do. And we know this. The people we love the most in our lives, we'll do anything. We'll suffer for them. We'll do anything for them. And Benedict's beloved was God. And Benedict knew that if this temptation conquered him, he would leave everything and he would basically enter that whole world of pleasure. So he did this profound act of mortification in order to free himself from this, because he loved God so much. And like we said, those of you who've been down the cloud of witnesses, this isn't anything new. Most of the saints, to a certain degree, maybe not to this extreme degree, but they practice mortification. Padre Pio, John Vianney, Mother Teresa, pretty much all of them practice different forms of mortification. So, Benedict, of course, his fame is growing. More monks are seeking his leadership. And there was an abbot of a nearby monastery who died. So the monks there said, great, the perfect guy to take over the monastery, or the abbey. Benedict, he'll be great. Okay. So they asked him at first, and he was like, not going to do it. I live in the cave. I want to do it myself. I'm not going to do this. And they kept on pressuring him and said, fine, I will take control of the abbey. Well, they immediately regretted their choice. Because Benedict came in there and he says, we need reforms. Especially the conversations. There's many unholy conversations going on. No unholy conversations, only conversations about holy things. He started all these reforms in there. Infuriating many of the monks. What is this guy doing? Why did we ask him to lead our abbey? He's turning it upside down. We don't want this. What kind of life is this? So, a group of monks decided to try to kill him. And what they did is they poisoned a glass of wine. This is actually stained glass. Many times Benedict has the cup of wine in images of Benedict, by the way. And the tradition was they would bring the wine to him, he would bless it, and then he would drink it. Well, they brought him the poison cup. And he made the sign of the cross over it. And when he did that, as Pope St. Gregory the Great said, as he made the sign of life over the poison, the cup crumbled. And the wine spilled on the floor. And he understood immediately what just happened. He knew that they tried to poison him. So he called all the monks together and he said this. He said, "May God have mercy on you." He goes, "Why did you do this to me?" He then said, "Look, you guys seek out your own way. You go your own direction. I'm going back to my cave. I'm leaving this. I'm not leading your abbey anymore." And he left. By the way, this is why some of you who have the St. Benedict medal, Benedict is known as a powerful protection against danger, against evil. And part of that comes from, there's more stories, but part of that comes from this, where he blesses the cup or the chalice with the poison in it, and his life is protected from that. So if you look on different symbols or on your medals, you'll see this there. Okay, so as much as Benedict wanted to be by himself, be with God, very soon after it, too many people were just coming to him. So he decided to organize them into little abbeys. So he would take 12 monks and he would form a little abbey. And he would take another 12 and form an abbey. So he formed these little communities of monks in the wilderness around Subiaco. And many nobles in Rome, of course, news already reached Rome, were sending their young men to go to Benedict because of what he was doing, the example that he was setting. So many people now started to go seek him to become monks or have their kids brought up under the direction of the monks. And one of the things Benedict did is he built 3 abbeys high up in the mountains of Subiaco. There was a problem, though. At least the monks saw it as a problem at first. Getting water. They had to keep going down the mountain to this lake and hauling up the water. So they called Benedict and they said, "Benedict, look, we have to move these abbeys, we have to move these monasteries because it's just too treacherous for us to go up and down the mountain." So the next day, Benedict was accompanied by a young monk named Placidus, and they went up the mountain and they continued a long time in prayer. And so Benedict immediately noticed, he turns to prayer. What do I do? He doesn't go into a panic and say, "Oh my goodness, I built a monastery, they're in the wrong place, what do we do?" No, he goes right to prayer. And he then takes 3 stones and he sets them on a rock and he goes back down. So the monks come to him and say, "Benedict, have you made a decision yet? Like, what are we going to do with the water? Like, you went up there, you prayed. Okay, what do we do? Are we moving?" And he said, "Go up there by the rock where I laid the 3 stones and start digging." So they start digging. And all of a sudden, the rock starts sweating water. And then they start digging some more, and it eventually forms a pool of water. So much so that the water now starts to flow down the mountain. And I found this very interesting because it's very similar to the story of Lourdes with St. Bernadette in the 19th century, where Mary said, "Dig here." And there's the miraculous spring that still flows to this very day, numerous cures at it. So Benedict had them dig, and he provided water for his monks. And, obviously these are extraordinary signs, but I think what God was doing is he's showing not only Benedict, but he's especially showing his monks that he is with them. His hand is upon us. He is blessing what they were doing, and he wants them to continue in this work. And and during this time, and Father Gabriel will talk more about this, this is when Benedict wrote, he authored this, the Rule of Monks, the Rule of St. Benedict. And the rule is fascinating because it's still adhered to today. And it just gives very simple but very clear and direct ways on how to be a holy monk. How to have balance in your life. So for work, for prayer, hospitality, what's the job or the duties of the abbot? What should the monks do in different situations? So it's a very practical rule on how to live for God. So this is what the monks came under. Benedict's rule, which, like I said, is still used till this day. Now, I had to tell this amazing story that took place as well. The young Placidus, he was walking around the base of the mountain, and he was getting water out of this lake. And it was at this time that he actually fell into the lake. And Gregory doesn't give all the details, but somehow he was taken out, he was kind of dragged out into the lake. And Benedict is in his cell, most likely praying. And it's revealed to him that this young monk is drowning. So he calls in one of the other monks. And he says to him, Morris, he says, Placidus fell into the lake, he's drowning, he says, you need to go rescue him. What? The monk he goes, quickly go. And so the monk takes off running. And he's running. Finally he gets to the lake, and he's still running, and he grabs Placidus and pulls him out of the lake, takes him to the shore, and then he realizes something. He's looking back, and he says, wait a second. He was out there. He realized that he had literally walked on water. So he actually became very fearful at this. And he ran up to Benedict and he said, what the heck? He goes, I was on the lake. And Benedict says, oh yes, don't worry. Benedict's kind of hushing him, okay. And he says, it's because of you. He says, no, it's not because of me, no. It's because of you. And he says, no, he says, it's because you were obedient. He's like, because you were obedient, you could do great things. And he left it at that. Benedict did not want to go further into that story, but he was rescued. So there was many stories like this that were circulating around. And of course, many people are attracted to holiness. We know that. But many people are also threatened by holiness. There was this certain priest who became very envious of Benedict. And he told people, do not go and see Benedict. I don't want you going to see him at all. And what's interesting, this isn't anything new. Those of you who've been in Cloud of Witnesses, they said that about Padre Pio, they said that about John Vianney, they say that about all the saints. So go and see it. Don't go there. There's always these enemies of the saints. And so what he did, he tried to stop people from going to Benedict, but they wouldn't listen. I mean, his reputation, the stories are circulating, and they're like, we just want to go see this guy. And sure, some out of deep said they want a conversion, but some, I'm sure, out of curiosity too. I mean, they're hearing these stories. I want to go see who this is. So he realized that he couldn't stop people from going to see him. So he decided to present Benedict with a loaf of bread, and this loaf of bread, like the wine, was poisoned. So it's given to Benedict. Benedict knew, they said immediately, that it was poisoned when it was handed to him. And Benedict thanked him for the bread. And then when he was in his cave, it was said that he had this raven or this crow that would go and he would feed on a daily basis. So many times in images of Saint Benedict, you see that even right there in that picture, back there, you see it. Right there, the raven next to Benedict. So, Benedict, the story goes that he told the bird, he said, take the bread and drop it in a remote location so nobody could get to it. And the bird was obedient and took the bread and dropped it in a remote location. Well, this particular priest realized that, okay, he can't kill Benedict. Somehow God's protecting this guy. But, I could kill his disciples. So, he hired, you could say, 7 women. And I don't know what he promised them, but he basically got them to go and dance naked in front of his abbeys. And they said, just go there, strip down, dance, frolic, make sure the monks see you. Make sure they see you. So they did this. And Benedict saw this spectacle that was going on, and he realized it was, oh no, this is going to pull many of the monks away. It'll be too powerful of a temptation. So what Benedict did is he just said, look, this is because of me. So he goes, I'm going to leave Subiaco, and I'm going to go somewhere else and found another abbey. So what he actually ended up doing is he left Subiaco and went to Cassino, which was another town up on a mountain. Now, eventually this priest was killed, and one of the monks came to Benedict and was rejoicing. He was like, hey, your enemy's dead, all right. And Benedict was very upset at the monk for rejoicing. He wanted his conversion, and he made the monk do penance for that. He said, no, we're not going to rejoice over the death of an enemy. He's like, we will not do that. You know, we're supposed to love your enemies. So he made this monk who was rejoicing do penance. So Benedict ended up at Cassino. It's a high up, remote mountain town. And while he was there, so he comes into the town, and he realizes something very interesting. There's paganism, the practice of paganism was still going on in this little nook, in this mountain town. They were worshiping the god Apollo. They had an altar, a shrine set up to him. There were all sorts of, as Gregory likes to say, devilish sacrifices going on in the woods surrounding the town. So, Benedict sees this and is like, oh my goodness. And so he decides to take decisive action against this. And so Benedict right away goes into the town and he tears down the altar dedicated to Apollo. He smashes the idol. And then, where all the sacrifices were taking place in this forest, he lights the forest on fire. He burns the forest to the ground because of this. And because he did this, because he realized what a danger this was to the souls of these people. I mean, they're doing these hideous practices in paganism, so he took very decisive action in this. And what he then ended up doing is he built a chapel to St. Martin, something that's called an oratory chapel, and he built a chapel to St. John the Baptist. Then he began to preach Christ to the people. And they said that many people were converted because of his preaching, because of his presence, and because of his example. He got them to stop these pagan practices. And it was said that it was here at Cassino, and we've seen this with other saints, that Satan became so enraged against Benedict that he literally appeared to him and he looked hideous. And the monks did not see him, but they heard the hideous sounds, his cursing at Benedict. And he said to Benedict, why are you persecuting me? But Benedict did not waver from his course, but kept on training his monks and growing in holiness. Benedict was also known to have the spirit of prophecy. There's one story about a Goth, a king Totila, and the Goths were one of these Germanic tribes that were coming in and out of Italy, sacking places, doing all sorts of things. And this particular king, of course, he's in Italy, and he hears about Benedict. Well, He's hearing that this guy's a prophet. He could tell you things about yourself. So he says, well, look, I don't believe this guy. I'm going to test him. So he took one of his servants, and he dressed him up as the king. And he says, oh, here, we have a big entourage. Go to see Benedict. And Benedict right away sees him. And he says, why are you wearing clothes that are not your own? And he says, you're not the king. And the guy became very fearful, ran back to King Totila and said, look, this guy is for real. He knew exactly I was not the king. So the king went out to see him, and Benedict encountered him and basically admonished him for his cruel life, how he was persecuting people. And then he gave him this prophecy. He said, you will reign for 9 years, but in the 10th year you will die. And it turned out that his prophecy was true. Also, Benedict had another incident just like Christ. They were short on bread. His monks, of course, were discouraged. We only have 5 loaves. What are we going to do? Benedict prayed, and the next day there were 200 bushels of meal. Again, Benedict's faith. There was also an Arian heretic named Azala that came to see Benedict. And the Arians were a group of Christians. They were a Christian heresy that denied, it basically said that Christ was created. He was not equal to the Father. So they came to see Benedict. Of course, he persecuted the Catholic faithful. And actually, how he came to see him, he captured a poor man and demanded his wealth. He said, I want your money. He says, where are you hiding his wealth? And the guy didn't have a lot of money. They said he was poor, but he had a little bit. And he said, well, I don't have my money at my home. He said, where do you have it? He goes, I have it with Benedict. So he said, okay, we're going to go see this Benedict who you're talking about. So he had the man all tied up. And they came to Benedict. And the story goes like this. Benedict looked at the spectacle before him. He stared at the bonds that were around the man's hands, and they fell off. Zala was, to say the least, was terrified of Benedict. Benedict said, come on, let's get something to eat. Let's have a meal together. They had a meal together, and then he admonished him for his cruel life, for how he was persecuting people. And according to Gregory doesn't say he had a dramatic conversion. Gregory said he went away a less cruel person. So after Benedict. So I don't know exactly what that means, but he wasn't as mean as before after this. Now, during this time, also, there's one just amazing story I wanted to point out, is there was a man whose son had died. And he brought the body of his son to the abbey. And Benedict wasn't there. And his father refused. He said, no, I'm not leaving, I got to see Benedict. And so Benedict came in from the fields. He was with the other monks. And the father says, I want you to raise my son. And Benedict said, no, those miracles are for the apostles. Not for our time. Those were for the apostles. And he said, no, I'm not leaving till you do it. You could do it. Please do it, Benedict. So Benedict, they said, the boy was laying on the ground, and he laid his body on top of the boy. Those of you who know Scripture, the prophet Lisle did that as well. And then he prayed to God, and the child's life was restored. So Benedict was known to raise the dead of a child. At this time, you're probably wondering about Scholastica, where Scholastica and all this. Well, what we kind of know, some speculation is that it would seem that at this time she was living possibly in a hermitage in a community of other women, according probably to a similar rule as Benedict. And here's where Gregory says, once a year, Scholastica would come to see her brother. And they would have, as he puts it, holy conversation. They would very much look forward to this time together. And then they would return before nightfall to their respective places. Well, one particular night, Scholastica asked her brother, she said, Benedict, let's not go home tonight. Let's talk the whole night. Come on. Benedict, being very much about his rule, absolutely not. I'm going back to my abbey. What are you talking about? And so he said, no, we have to go. And there was just monks with him and some sisters with her. Well, Scholastica is not discouraged. She's like her brother in a lot of ways. She bowed her head, and they said tears flowed down her face. And she prayed. And all of a sudden, thunder was heard. And it started to rain. And not just a drizzle. All of a sudden, a magnificent storm started falling. The rain was so heavy that they said they peeked their head out the door. They couldn't go. They were trapped there. Benedict was upset. He knew that she got her petition answered, and Scholastica said to her brother, "Don't be upset." She goes, "I desired that you should stay, and you did not listen to me. So I petitioned our Lord, and He listened to me." And so they talked the whole night together, and as Pope St. Gregory the Great said, Scholastica's prayer was answered because she loved more. 3 days later, Benedict was at his window, and his sister passed away. Did she know that her life would end so soon, and that's why she wanted to stay? But Benedict was granted a vision of her soul ascending to heaven like a dove, and he was so moved that he had her buried in his own grave. Benedict's life would soon be over as well. He told his monks the exact day of his death. And what's interesting about that is, for many of the saints that we have done in Cloud of Witnesses have known the date of their death. So surprisingly, many of them knew exactly or pretty close to when they would die. Benedict said that he would die on this day. He became very ill. And on the 6th day, he asked to be carried into the chapel in order to receive the Eucharist. And so Benedict received the Eucharist. And it says two monks were holding him up. And Benedict gave up his spirit a little bit after receiving the Eucharist. And one of the monks, there was actually one monk who was in his cell, who was in the vicinity, and there was another monk who was far away. And it was interesting because they both had the same vision. And Gregory records this for us. They said they looked up in the east and saw basically a huge tapestry in heaven. And shining on it were this infinite number of lamps. And there was a man reverently attired. And he asked them, he said, "Do you know who passed this way?" And the monks, both of them, responded the same way, no, we don't. And the man answered, "This is the way by which the beloved servant of God, Benedict, ascended into heaven. His glorious entrance into heaven." And Benedict then was buried at the chapel of St. John the Baptist, where he overthrew the altar dedicated to Apollo. But of course, with the saints, really, their death just begins really the big story, you could say. Because as we know in the communion of saints, the saints are more alive now. You know, none of us lived in the 6th century, but we all have access to St. Benedict and St. Scholastica. We can ask for their prayers. And very soon afterwards, this is the cave. where he was living in. Miracles started to take place, especially at the cave where he lived as a hermit, praying and communing with God. In fact, there was a woman, they said she was suffering with mental illness, and she was wandering around aimlessly throughout the land. And she wasn't searching out Benedict or his cave or anything like that, but the story goes that she fell asleep in his cave, and when she woke up the next morning, she was completely cured. She was completely back to herself. So many miracles, many great things happened after the death of Benedict of Scholastica. And probably the greatest miracle, yes, many people were cured. Probably the greatest miracle was the numerous Benedictine monasteries that began to spring up all over Italy, all over Europe, and just fan out into the world. And all these monks, all these men and women who dedicated their lives to this role of Benedict. All because, as a young man, he decided to leave behind, all the pleasures of this world that he could have experienced in Rome, and seek God above all things. And now, if he would have done that, we would have never, his name would have disappeared in history. But because he chose a path of total devotion and service to God, we're still talking about him in the 21st century. We still have people like Father Gabriel following his rule, following his way of life. So it's interesting, everybody wants to be famous, everybody wants to make an impact. But what we see throughout history, it's really the saints who allow themselves to be transformed by Christ, to be transformed by God, who really make the biggest impact. Because they don't just make an impact in their present day, but their life echoes hundreds, with Benedict for 1,000 years, 1,500 years into the future, still going forward. So